Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to this GIJN Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar. I see people still coming in, but welcome to everyone. Once again, it's great to be joined by people from all over the world for this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on investigating the pandemic. We've been running a fair number of these. This one, we're bringing together 4 senior journalists today from India, Bosnia, Uganda, and the United States to reflect on the role investigative journalism has played so far in the pandemic and to discuss where we go from here. My name is Anne Koch, and I'm the Program Director at GIJN, and I'm moderating today. So once again, welcome. Although the global pandemic is very far from over, and indeed there are some experts suggesting it's barely started, about 6 months into the pandemic, it seems a good moment to reflect on the role of investigative journalism so far and what avenues and opportunities lie ahead. As one of today's speakers, Syed Nazakat, put it, one thing is clear, that it will remain the biggest story in the world for some time, and it's going to smash into our electoral politics and lives in unpredictable ways. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but for those of you joining us for the first time, a brief introduction to GIJN. The Global Investigative Journalism Network is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations. We've got 184 member organizations in 77 countries, but we work with journalists everywhere, with freelancers, with commercial journalists in the commercial media, and with nonprofits. Just to point out, we've got a lot of resources that on the pandemic and other things, but particularly on the pandemic, the topic of this webinar. If you check out our website, GIJN.org, we've done more than 40 webinars, for example, in 7 languages. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers, and I'm delighted that we've been joined by 4 senior journalists, 3 with many years of investigative experience, and 1 who's thought a great deal about the role of the media in public life. Syed Nazakat is a journalist, media entrepreneur, and founder and editor-in-chief of DataLEADS, a Delhi-based firm which conducts data analysis, visualization, Pan-Asia boot camps, and India's first data-driven website dedicated to healthcare reporting. Miranda Patrucic is senior editor for Central Asia at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project in Sarajevo. She's played a pivotal role in probes that have led to government investigations in multiple countries, prison sentences for corrupt officials, and more than $1 billion in penalties and seized properties. Peter Mwesige is co-founder of the African Center for Media Excellence in Uganda. He has worked as a group training editor of the Nation Media Group, East Africa's biggest multimedia company. He has also worked as a consultant on journalism, communication, media, and politics for UNDP, UNESCO, and the World Bank. And Jeanne Lenzer is an independent medical investigative journalist and former Knight Science Journalism Fellow. She's a regular contributor to the international medical journal, the BMJ, and her articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, the London Independent, and many other publications. So today we're going to focus on 3 areas. First of all, the best examples of investigative or data-driven journalism, and these have been selected by our panelists. Secondly, some of the areas that could be improved in investigation, and then finally, some suggestions about topics and areas that need further investigation, mostly in the pandemic story, but also elsewhere. If people choose to raise other issues, that's also good. We'll discuss these issues for about 1 hour, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And the audience, please ask those questions in the Q&A box, which you can see below. And we'll get to as many as we can. And you can ask questions anytime, starting now. And then when the speakers are finished and we finish the discussion, my colleague Eunice Au will join us to moderate the questions. We'll share all of the information that's being presented today in the chat box and maybe other links as well. And just to let everyone know finally that we are recording this session. So, time to start. After that introduction, I'd like to start with the first question about some of the better or best investigations. I mean, we know that investigative journalism takes a great deal of time and resources, not to speak of evidence. So there's no doubt, it seems to me, that some of the greatest work is still to be done. But it's good to hear about some of the outstanding work that's been published or broadcast to date. And I'd like to ask Syed to start, please.
Thank you so much, Anne. It has been really wonderful to be part of this last webinar on the pandemic. And as you rightly said, we are dealing with a very strange situation across the world, a situation which we have never seen. And I think the investigative journalists have a really fundamental role here, because we are half through it, kind of. It has been almost 4 or 5 months. And we have went through a situation where we still do not have the answers how long this situation will continue. But we know for sure that this has been the biggest ever story in our lives. And I think every newsroom has dedicated all its resources to cover the COVID-19. And I think the next couple of months are going to be crucial, essentially, for investigative journalists around the world. Why? Because we still do not have answers to a lot of questions which deal essentially with the fundamental responsibilities of the states, of the different governments in different parts of the world, and their response to the public health. So coming back to the stories, which really, you can see personally, which happened in Asia, I'm looking from an Asian perspective. The stories, I think there have been a number of stories, I think dozens of stories with a world-class investigation and data. I've selected a couple of them. Of course, the first one from our own colleagues at the DataLEADS, which essentially also showed the power of data. And often when we talk about data and investigative journalists still feel uncomfortable using a lot of data. So this story essentially in the middle of pandemic is March 27, when we released this story, which was essentially a story based on at the heart of pandemic. What is at the heart of pandemic? Is a wildlife trade. That's the source of everything, which China somehow beautifully was managing to hide from the rest of the world. They're saying, no, it was coming from a fish market. We still do not know what's happening. Oh, no, it's coming from somewhere else, and we have nothing to do with the story, actually. So our colleagues at Health Analytics Asia, they went through the historical data. So that was the most beautiful part of it, that the data was already available with the UN, and it was almost 6 million data files. So what they did, they obtained that open source data from the UN website. They put a code out there, got the data, cleaned it up. The moment they were actually cleaning the files, putting it in a simple Excel sheet, and then the flourish to visualize it, it was almost clear what China was hiding from the rest of the world. That China, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, has become the world's biggest exporter of wildlife. And that wildlife is the key source for this COVID-19, and it has been the source of other zoonotic diseases. Globally, the WHO has identified 33 diseases, viral diseases, which originate from wildlife. And COVID's essentially, now it's almost clear the source either has been the pangolin or for the bats. Whatever, it's essentially the wildlife. I think that the beauty of this story was that the two things, actually. One was that they used historical data. They used data which was already available, but they just clubbed different points together. And then the story emerged, a global story, which was showing China biggest exporter. China's policies in the last 20, 25 years have failed to control the wildlife. In fact, it has helped Chinese business to emerge as biggest wildlife sources. And then the lot of companies in Europe essentially helping China to emerge as the world's biggest wildlife trader. I think that is why I think the story was quite strong. Then also, I looked at a couple of different ways how to look at great stories. I also saw stories from China, remarkable data-driven stories covering different early stories about infrastructure for the people. I saw stories from Pakistan, so wonderful reports from that country as well. I saw stories from Nepal covering how the country's basic infrastructure is not matching up with the challenge. But then I picked the story from Myanmar just for a point, that it is touching the role of big tech companies in the COVID, actually. And it's also touching the mode of political strategies and political campaigns, particularly in Asia, where the regimes actually are using the COVID situation in a way to hold more power. We have seen that happening in Philippines, that happening in other countries. In Myanmar, which is going for election next year. So I found this story from Myanmar now, essentially highlighting that part and capturing the serious concerns of the people in Myanmar. What if the politicians, the wealthy politicians, use big tech platforms like the Facebook to influence the voters? Why does they leave the poor party or poor candidates who don't have so much money? And they have collected data, they have collected votes. It was a forward-looking story. Election is happening next year or later this year. So they were looking at the trends which are happening and putting the spotlight on something which can go wrong. I think that was also a beautiful way of capturing what could happen next after what's happening with the COVID, because everybody is covering the stories of number of cases and deaths. But the Myanmar now actually looked at the politics and looked at the heart of the political discourse in the country. From India, I looked at a story which was a very small story, not really huge data, not really huge investigation, but the whole story was focused on one single hospital in Bangalore, which is India's Silicon Valley. So I think the power of investigative journalism is also sometimes, because when we talk about watchdog reporting, it looks like we all are talking about a Panama Papers story all the time. No, we are also looking at smaller stories which have a critical need to people be aware about what's happening. The story was essentially about how a particular hospital, which was the first COVID hospital in India's tech state, how almost 97% who got admitted in ICU, intensive care unit, died. And the story collected the data, it collected the age of different people who got admitted in that hospital. I found that story very interesting from a point of view that it was putting light on local stories and making them national stories. And I think these stories were reflected in different ways and means across Asia. And I think I personally feel that investigative journalists are doing exceptional work in given situations and with limited resources and the kind of political atmosphere we are having in different parts of Asia. Yeah, over to you, Anne.
Thank you. That's really interesting, the watchdog role there in very, very different ways, well brought out. Miranda, I'm going to go to you next. Thank you, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. You are on mute. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, GIJN. I think you guys have done a pivotal work really during this pandemic, helping reporters get resources and knowledge on how to basically continue to work on stories despite the challenges and difficulties. The question you ask is actually extremely difficult to answer because there has been so much good work that reporters have done over the past months and are continuing to do. So the example I selected are basically more because of a little something that is more unique about them. So I'm gonna first show the work. Oh, okay, sorry, here it is.
So we can see that well.
You can see that well, perfect. Okay, so I wanted to first showcase a project that OCCRP has been working on since the beginning of the pandemic. We dubbed it Crime, Corruption, and Coronavirus. And the reason we thought to focus on crime and corruption is because obviously we cannot compete with the daily flow of information. And we wanted to use what the strength of our network is and all the reporters in different countries and basically focus on people who are trying to make use of the pandemic and basically enrich themselves on the troubles of the world. So my colleagues have done really fascinating reporting, working together as a team across countries. And their most recent story was actually about protective equipment, which is basically either faulty or fake, that is being sold across Europe. And the story, none of them would individually be able to do the story, but working together as a team from many countries, they were able to basically uncover it. They've been looking into COVID tests. They were looking into public spending through, procurement. And another thing that they've done is basically they've been scraping the tender databases across Europe, trying to basically get on top of what's happening with the public spending. But then also they've been looking into, what's happening with cocaine trade now that everybody's on the lockdown. So I thought this was kind of like a very unique view, focused primarily on the crime and corruption. But then the other story I would like to show was actually the story that was, or the series that was done by New York Times. And I think for me personally, that was kind of like, even though it's, ocean away and, a whole different country, just being able to see the people, who died because of the corona. Because very often, especially in my part of the world, when they give us a death statistics, they just say, well, yes, it's older person or younger person, but had all kinds of other health issues. And it feels that there is no human behind the numbers. And I think for me, this story was really a reality call where you can see, well, it's young, it's old, it's people from all kinds of background, with, those who have access to good medicine, those who don't have access to medicine, and so on. But another reason why I'm showing it is largely in our part of the world, also in Central Asia, the government has been not providing a full statistics of the consequences of coronavirus. And I think inspired by the work that was done by New York Times, 7 media organizations in Kazakhstan has actually joined forces to go and try to dig out into the death toll for the pandemic in Kazakhstan. And what's really important, it's one of the countries where it's extremely difficult to report. The government has been, not telling the truth in terms of the toll and basically responsibility for what's happening in the country. And these organizations who are under tremendous pressure have decided to work together and basically, track down, the real numbers. And they ended up publishing a very similar project to New York Times, and they're still publishing. And basically, their motive is basically to give the families of the victims, last word, to basically, have those people be remembered. So those are 2 examples I wanted to show. I think it's, there has been so much good reporting, and, reporters from all over the world, they've been uncovering, stories about government lying to the public. They've been uncovering stories about, fake statistics on, how many ventilators countries have, how many people have died, like all these stories, and they're really important stories. And, the work continues. So.
Thank you, Miranda. I mean, the Kazakh example is really, really interesting. And I think we're seeing all kinds of interesting collaborations among journalists in this period. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Peter now. Thank you. Peter, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you, GIJN. Before I get into the examples, I wanted to share just results of research we did recently at ACME on newspaper coverage of COVID-19 in Uganda from January to April. One of the things that our research shows is most of the reporting formats that were employed by reporters, where hard news, the conventional hard news, she said reporting. Investigative reporting occupied only 0.4% of all the stories that we looked at. And journalists have basically argued, perhaps rightly so, that the enormity of the developing story, made it very difficult for investigations, at least at the beginning of the pandemic. There was too much uncertainty and just too much going on every single day. But also, there's lots of inexperience and ill-preparedness in our newsrooms. And that's true of Uganda as it is true of Kenya, Tanzania, and elsewhere in the region. There are also human resource challenges. There are very few reporters who are deployed to cover this story because very many media houses have been trying to lay off their own workers because of the challenges, the disruptions caused by the pandemic. There were lockdown restrictions. And of course, some have argued that the time is still too early, too soon, that this is still unfolding. Maybe we should expect even better investigations in the coming weeks, coming months. Having said that, there have been some good examples of investigations. One of them was from Uganda, and it was done by an award-winning journalist who won the BBC's Komla de Mo award. He's called Solomon Sewanja. He covered this story for NBS TV. It's called The Eyes Have It. Those who have covered Parliament know what the eyes, usually what that means, the eyes have it. And it basically looks at, it sort of is a very good story that documents, you know, how members of Parliament decided to allocate themselves part of the money that was made for the government's COVID response. And it's a very skillful use of, you know, documents, footage from Parliament itself, fairly public documents really, to tell a story that had captivated the national, you know, imagination. Another one is on it's the New Vision. I don't have a link to that one because the New Vision has a paywall. But it was a very good story that investigated a scam around travel permits issued by resident district commissioners who are in Uganda. They represent the central government at the district, you know, level. And they sort of use some undercover reporting techniques to show, you know, how these officials were actually accepting or taking bribes to give permission to people who were sick or who had, you know, who had to attend to relatives in hospital and so on and so forth. Quite a good, you know, powerful story. There's also a story, controversial a bit, called Virus Safaris. That was done by the Citizen TV in Kenya. It looked again at, you know, how Kenyans, passengers, mainly ordinary people, were sort of beating government roadblocks, you know, manned by security forces through bribes and all kinds of trickery. I think we have a similar story in Nigeria, where again corrupt security officials are cited in breaching, you know, a travel ban that had been imposed. The thing about both of these stories is they use undercover reporting to sort of, you know, tell the story of what was going on with some of the restrictions that the government had put in place. Of course, there's a danger that, you know, the journalists who are doing this undercover reporting could have exposed themselves to, you know, the virus itself. You know, I mean, I've seen some of the circumstances under which they put themselves. It's kind of a bit scary, but well, some would say that comes with the territory. And finally, I've seen a story from Zimbabwe, which sort of looks at procurement gone wrong. It basically implicates President Mnangagwa in a scam involving companies that had been registered in just under a month or so, you know, being given huge contracts to supply PPE, protective, you know, personal protective equipment. And that, I think, is a fairly powerful story that uses documents from both Interpol, from the government, and all that. Then, allow me very quickly to comment on Miranda's example of the New York Times story on those we have lost. That actually was a very powerful story, you know, and I think the nation in Kenya tried something along those same lines some weeks later, and it is powerful. It's always a story that humanizes, you know, shows you, you know, the human side of, you know, this, who actually is dying from COVID. It's not just numbers, but, you know, there are people with relatives, with children, people with dependents, and so on and so forth. One last story was done by The Monitor in Kampala that looked at the human rights, I think they call it counting the costs of the lockdown rights abuses. And this one, again, sort of documents various local stories into one huge special report that shows, you know, the price that especially ordinary people have paid as, you know, security officials especially tried to implement the government's stringent measures on the lockdown. Over to you, Anne.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. The 0.4% of all the stories in Uganda being from the investigative side is a sobering statistic, and we'll return to it. It might not be that far off elsewhere, I have to say, but yeah, right. Jeanne, over to you, please. Jeanne, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry. Yeah, it's great.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks so much to GIJN. What a great opportunity to learn from these other journalists. And so one article that I saw that was particularly good here in the US was by Tatiana Monet, and she wrote an article for opensecrets.org. And Open Secrets is an organization that tracks money into politics and public health. And her article is entitled "Dark Money Groups Pushed Trump to Back Unproven COVID-19 Treatment." And she tracked the money that went through pharma, which is PHRMA. It's the biggest pharmaceutical trade organization. And it went to a lot of very right-wing groups that backed Trump. And she tracks how that money went to a campaign urging Trump to promote hydroxychloroquine. And I guess most people are familiar by now with his promotion of crazy ideas, including hydroxychloroquine, which at the time didn't have much evidence. Since then, there have been more studies. But what I wanted to talk about is that represents not just, that story represents not just an issue around hydroxychloroquine in particular, but to the larger issue of deregulation, which the billionaires are after like crazy, and they use crisis to promote deregulation. And so the idea that they would push the FDA to let doctors use this drug without evidence of benefit is very much what pharma wants, and they want it across the board, not just for hydroxychloroquine. So it's a bigger issue than was even hinted at in the article, though it was an excellent article, and Open Secrets does good work along those lines. So one of the things I thought I'd mention is that there's sort of the outside the box reporting and inside the box. And the outside the box is the kind of reporting that many investigative journalists are familiar with. You take the science, whether it's testing or public health measures or treatments, and you leave that alone, but what you look at is the distribution of these things equitable? How's it affecting different populations? You know, was PPE distributed reasonably? Same thing with ventilators. Also things like, was economic relief given to everyday people, or was it just given to rich people? And here in the US, we see stories like that where big business gets all sorts of forgivable loans in the billions, while people who've lost their jobs because of COVID are now facing eviction because they can't pay their rent, and they're not getting relief. So that's sort of the externalities, the outside the box reporting. The inside the box actually opens up the door to what's there. What is the testing worth? What are the public health measures doing, and treatments? And that's what I work on a lot. So when this whole hydroxychloroquine thing broke and the FDA gave emergency approval, yes, doctors can use it, and Trump's saying yes, and China's saying yes, this is a good drug, I decided to look at the science that was supposedly what Trump was referring to, and it was awful. So Didier Raoult was the doctor who supposedly conducted this study that he reported as positive. It's going to save people, he said. And I want to just mention one little technical issue that's going to come up, and then I want to urge listeners to look at the tip sheet, and I'll put that up at some point. But I do have a tip sheet, and you can also get information at my website. But before I open up that Pandora's box, I want to say, beside what I'm saying, you need to listen to independent medical experts, people who don't have financial conflicts of interest. And there's an international list of medical experts that's available to journalists free. And I encourage people to avail themselves of that list, because it's going to be impossible to learn all the medicine and science. I'll give one small example. So Didier Raoult, this doctor who said, yes, hydroxychloroquine works, he did it based on what we call a surrogate marker. a surrogate marker is a number. It's something that measures an outcome, but it doesn't tell us clinically whether the person actually does any better. So you can have an instance in which, like Didier Raoult, what did he look at? He looked at, was there COVID virus in the noses of the patients after they were treated with hydroxychloroquine? And he found that many of the patients who took hydroxychloroquine didn't have COVID in their noses compared to the group that didn't get it. The only problem is that that same study also showed that there were 6 terrible outcomes. I think there were 3 deaths, 2 patients had to be transferred to ICU. They were so sick at the time the study closed, and another patient left the study. All 6 of those bad outcomes were in the patients who got hydroxychloroquine, and none of the patients who had usual care had a bad outcome. So this is how he got away with saying this is a good drug, because he was reporting a surrogate outcome. And again, I don't expect everybody to be able to dive into them. That's just one of many, many different ways that investigators can play the numbers. And a lot of times there's big money behind it. So tracking the money on the outside is important, but also looking at the science is important. And I encourage people to go to the industry list of independent medical experts. And I'll try to put up my.
Great. I mean, because you're starting to go into the second area, which is, you've done a great jump into the second question about areas we need to think about, improving, or there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of science, so yeah, that you're starting to really get to this point, Jeanne, while you put your slide up.
Well, now I'm stuck because for some reason my slide came up. I can't even get out. I can't escape out. That's all I'm seeing, my own slide. And there's no button to push that says stop or share.
Well,
so
well,
I don't know.
Why don't you just talk to the points, maybe?
Okay.
Because we're going to share all your information.
Okay.
So
great.
I know it's beautiful stuff because I've seen it, and it's a shame that we can't share it right now. But it's also we can share it. So I think if you talk really about the key issues you think in terms of going forward, what we need to really think about, areas where we need. Thanks.
So, and by the way, people can also go to my website at jeannelenzer.com and get these resources, including the tip sheet. But I guess one of the things I want to talk about is
it's just come up.
It did. That's bizarre. That is strange. I didn't touch a thing, and it's just doing it, huh? And I don't see any of you. I no longer see our screen. I can't get out of my own screen, so I'm just going to be talking.
We see Lenzer's tip sheet for journalists.
Okay. All righty.
So go for it.
So the complexity of the issues I want to discuss, and that is that surprisingly, despite numerous pandemics in the past, we really know very little about about the measures that make a difference. And I want to mention a wonderful book called Epidemics in History, Disease, Power, and Imperialism by Sheldon Watts. It's a scholarly book. And one of his conclusions was, after looking at multiple pandemics, was that he said the measures taken from shutdown of workplaces to quarantines often caused more harm than the disease itself. And these were for major pandemics. Now, I know that's not something that as a progressive I'm supposed to be saying, because most of us on the sort of left side of the spectrum are saying that, President Trump and other authoritarian leaders are pushing us in a wrong direction. They don't care about lives, they only care about money. But on a real level, what we're seeing is everyday people who are faced with not a question of maybe 1 in 10,000, which is the realistic risk that they might die of COVID, but the real risk, the 1 in 1, tomorrow, I'm going to be pushed out of my home. I'm going to be homeless. And we know that job losses lead to increased deaths, a surprising number of deaths. And we know that the wealth gap leads to deaths. And so what I would urge people to do is don't talk about lockdown as a single entity, because it's not. It includes many things. And we see that with Sweden, with the UK, with Singapore, tremendous differences in what people are doing in response to the pandemic. And it's extremely hard to tease out which of these measures are making a difference. So we have some places that locked down severely, and some had terrible outcomes, and some didn't have terrible outcomes. And then we see other places like Sweden, which didn't completely lock down, but they did encourage some voluntary distancing and safe spaces. And yet despite having their young children go to school, they did not see a bump in deaths among children. So let's look at things, whether it's masks, whether it's quarantine, whether it's closing workspaces, open air parks. What are the different aspects of lockdown? And is there any way to tease apart which ones are making a difference? And we should also report the harms as well as the benefits of these various components. We can't measure the outcome just in how many people died of COVID. We have to look at how much increase in violence has there been. In the United States, it's been a tremendous bump in gun violence. How much deaths of what they call deaths of despair has there been? And deaths of despair come from drinking more, drugging more, suicide, homicide. These are the things that happen as people are out of work. And definitely, each country's policies are going to make a difference. So countries that have a good safety net probably won't see as many deaths of despair. In the United States, there's very little safety net for people. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing a tremendous rise in these kinds of problems. I think there's another thing about complexity, and that is you can't just compare one region to another. And I want to say that we need to do, it's hard to do, but we have to put politics aside as much as possible. There's sort of a uniform response to the measures here in the US by the left and by the right. And I don't fall in either line. Politically, I'm on the left, but when it comes to the science, we have to take each piece as it comes. And I want to give one example. Stephen Miller, who is Trump's right-hand man, a true racist, ultra-right-wing guy. There was a headline that announced that he was denying that his grandmother died of COVID just to play politics. And my instant reaction is, that dog, that's what he would do, because these people are pushing the idea that COVID isn't bad and it's not really hurting anyone, and he's going to deny that his grandmother died. But then I decided to put those kind of thoughts aside and actually look at the case. And here's the case. His grandmother was 92 years old. She developed a mild case of COVID in March, was never hospitalized for it, and died at 92 3 months later. Now, was that a death from COVID or not? I don't know the answer to that, but these are the complexities that if you talk to some of the independent scientists and experts on the list, you'll find out that they have a lot of concern about, are we reporting deaths with COVID or deaths from COVID? And the with COVID part is hard. I mean, if many people are infected asymptomatically and they die, some hospitals are demanding that those be reported as COVID deaths. But we don't really know. So we have to look carefully at the measures that are being taken, as well as how these outcomes are being judged. And I think it's such an extraordinarily complex area that I don't think we're going to be able to get the answers in real time. I think we're going to have to wait, we're going to have to watch, we're going to be grateful for different approaches and see which ones really seem to pay off.
Good, thank you. Sorry, you haven't finished.
No, that's enough for me to now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The complexity is really difficult. People, especially when you need evidentially based work, it's very, very difficult and challenging. Syed, you were going to raise a couple of points here on things we need to improve, and I believe you actually have some more slides.
Yeah, no, I think essentially the situation we are currently in, we need to have a strategy how we are going to cover the situation moving forward. Actually, and what are the couple of areas which can change the way the investigative journalists are working around the world to investigate a lot of factors and scenarios associated with this pandemic, which has been so devastating for the whole global world, actually, for every part of the world is affected. I think there are a lot of stories. I can see hundreds and tens and thousands of stories, small stories, big stories. I can see a lot of data coming in. I can see a lot of challenges as well. But I personally believe that one of the fundamental things which we really need to work hard is to find our collaborators, is to find people who can collaborate with us on this story. Because this story in its scale is so big and is science-driven, is health, is big technical. We can't go with half-truths here. So we need to find partners who can build collaboration with investigative journalists around the world to try to make sense of what's happening, what could possibly also happen, what are the couple of areas where we need to put our heads together and come together. I can give one example from India where we did something which was quite unique actually, which started much before COVID, which was essentially an initiative of DataLEADS in which we invited some 20 doctors and 20 journalists in a remote part of India together to explore whether doctors and journalists can work on stories, on data collection, on cleaning data, or even brainstorming about possible story ideas. And that we did this almost like 5 years back, like really long actually, when you look at it in terms of like what's happening now. And on health, to be honest, I always covered insurgencies, wars, human rights situations across the world, but health was quite fascinating space in terms of that, in our part of the world, there's no focus on health. It's not a page one story, never ever, unless something goes really wrong. So we did that in 2016, I think, and then I was pleasantly surprised that all the doctors, the 20 doctors who we invited for that event workshop, they were actually also excited about it. And they were there in the room 8:30 in the morning. And then we took that initiative to different parts of Asia. So we ended up doing similar data boot camps with doctors in 11 countries in the last 4 years, in which we have interacted, build a community of a couple of thousand doctors across Asia. Then last year, we thought, like, let's take this collaboration to a next level. Next level essentially means let's have these doctors also in a way with us where they can essentially help us cleaning, helping, understanding, interpreting data, and maybe also fact checking, because we saw a huge tide of medical misinformation going around on social media. And then we invited them for a summit in Bangalore, some of them, and then we did another summit in collaboration with the Google News Initiative in Singapore. Some of them joined there. But essentially, we put an open call on social media saying that we're looking for a help from doctors, technologists, and data scientists to help us to fact check and improve the coverage on health. To our surprise, more than 100 doctors applied for a voluntary position from across Asia. Out of them, we selected some 18 or 19 folks from 16 plus Asian countries. So when the COVID happened, we were actually able to cover the situation much better compared to other big organizations, because luckily one of our fact checkers was from China and a couple of them were in Hong Kong. So they were able to understand the Mandarin. They were able to understand what's happening on the ground. That quite phenomenally changed the situation in terms of covering the situation, covering the pandemic, the way it was emerging. So you can see all of these doctors who have been part of this initiative. So what we did, if you look at it practically, logistically, how was it done? It was a simple call on a social media asking doctors to join us as a fact checkers. We essentially asked them in a very clear term that we need their 2 hours every month, not more than that. We understand doctors, data scientists, quite busy people. Maybe just let's have 2 hours from each one of them and see how that could help the storytelling and journalism and all. And then eventually it started having daily conversation on a messaging app, emails. They started writing more. Some of them are now dedicated columnists with a great insight about critical situations. So when I think of other areas, like what are the other areas where we can build collaboration with other people? I see great space working with technologists. We are already working, number of media organizations, newsrooms are already working with technologists, big way, right? I see possible collaboration with postmen. In your country, if you have an association of postmen, as an investigative journalist, they can be a great source of confirming addresses, because they have been delivering couriers in your neighborhoods from years. They know everyone, they know the story of everyone. So if you want to confirm whether somebody is sick or died, you can call a postman if he is in part of your network. You can check religious leaders for that matter. They can be great source of information or confirmation of information. You can check military veterans, they have their own associations. You can check lawyers. The lawyers have the world's biggest gold mine. They have all the documents with them, thousands and thousands of pages of documents. That could provide you a remarkable insight even about the COVID. In India, for example, one of the first cases about the COVID corruption was a court case, which nobody covered first because then nobody was covering the courts during the COVID. It was essentially a case against a company by another company, alleging them that they were having a partnership to procure some equipment from China, but other company cheated them and they went along and procured those materials and all. And it became a court case and eventually a story. I think, like scientists, certainly, yes, community, there's a great list of people who can be remarkable, you can say collaborators, particularly for big stories in the next 7-8 months. So my suggestion, humble suggestion would be for a journalist across the world, identify who are the people in your community who have a knowledge, expertise, which can put spotlight on critical stories, which you will not be able to cover on your own. Because also during the COVID, physical security is also critical. You can't go out all the time and visit spaces and people. You need to have a list of people ready who you can call and they can trust you and you can trust them. That will only happen if you have some bit of collaboration, if you're transparent with them, why you need them and how their support can make difference in that particular story. I think that is really, I personally feel that, you can cover any story and you can do great work and all, but you need really good collaborators who essentially could be also non-journalists. You don't need collaboration only within journalism, between the journalists, but collaboration with a lot of experts, public health experts, virologists, like all these important people who have a domain expertise and knowledge. Yes.
Good suggestion. So that's a big area, a lot of food for thought there. Really interesting. I'm going to move straight to Peter. I'm watching the clock a little. Sorry, Peter, please. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, what's the question, Anne?
We're looking at sort of areas of improvement, things people can do better. If you want to talk about, if you want to go straight to some of your suggestions for the future, by all means.
Let me just talk about some of the weaknesses which could be worked on. I think we need to do a little more in terms of questioning official narratives. We need to not allow only government officials, presidents, and others, to frame the story. I think that there are so many other voices that are, knowledgeable about what's going on that should be brought into, the story of this pandemic. We also, I think, journalists need to provide, make better sense of the numbers. There's been so much throwing around of numbers without attempting to provide context behind the numbers and, make them speak to actual issues and the so what or significance of what's going on. Then I've noticed, and I think Jeanne talks about this a bit, I've noticed that in this part of the world, there's been very little reporting on emerging and new medical research, or academic research on COVID-19, the epidemiology and all other aspects of this, including the treatment or, the care of patients. I think that we need to cultivate, some kind of specialization that can allow more journalists to make sense of what is actually being said by different, experts from all over the world. I've seen, for instance, some of the responses to the recent viral video of the Nigerian or Cameroonian or whatever it is who claims chloroquine, is an effective treatment for COVID-19. And it is clear that a lot of people, including journalists who have been circulating that video, haven't looked at other studies that respond to some of the claims that people are making. So I think more needs to be done in that area. Then I'm worried about the parochial outlook, at least in this part of the world. Again, I've noticed, for instance, that just like it was in April, we still don't have that much attention to neighboring countries like Tanzania, where recently their former president, was buried. We saw pictures of 3 former presidents, standing together at the funeral without masks, you know, quite close to each other. So what's really going on in that country? I think that, you know, that story needs to be told. I mean, we need to cover COVID-19 beyond our borders, because after all, I mean, this is a disease that knows no borders or boundaries, you know. And then I think I mentioned this earlier on. I hope that the journalists, you know, don't get themselves in harm's way as they are trying to tell this story, because I've seen some of them, you know, forgetting about social distancing and forgetting about wearing their masks when they are trying to do some of this reporting, including undercover reporting. So I think that their safety comes first. You know, there's no story worth dying for.
Thank you, Peter. That's a really good list of areas to work on, isn't it? You've given us. Thank you. Miranda, what about you? What's your thinking here?
I'll be very quick because I think everybody else has given so many really great suggestions. I think what I feel is missing, the news is happening so fast, things are changing so fast. And I feel sometimes when I want to go back and look into an issue, I will find so many opposing, you know, stories. And what I feel is missing sometimes is just like telling the full truth, going back into those, you know, key issues. I mean, we had so many examples here, for example, in my part of the world, in other parts of the world where, you know, procurement of respirators, and, you know, there were so many like corruption allegations and so on, but like it kind of disappears and dies out. And I think setting a record straight on these like essential stories would be really important, and just like looking at and you know, having one place, you know, or a publication where you can really learn what happened and what is the real truth. And then other thing is, I also feel sometimes that, you know, the government, you know, many of the governments in the parts of the world where I'm covering are not very transparent about what's going on. And I think something the journalists need to stop doing is, okay, let's stop bitching that they're not giving us information. Let's try to think creatively of how we can actually get information, whether it means let's go and try to develop some sources, you know, let's find some other ways where you can find out where the money is going, and basically pushing that instead of just saying, okay, this is it, this is what we can do. And I think another topic is, you know, okay, all our governments were unprepared for the pandemic. Did it really change? I mean, there was so much money that went into, you know, either through loans or through, you know, changes in the budget. But does it mean that our hospitals, you know, got all the equipment? Are they buying all the medicine? And from what I'm seeing in, you know, my part of the world, no, they don't have all the equipment. They don't have all the medicine. And, you know, the government is still spending money on various things that you might think you don't really need to spend money on at this time. So, I mean, those would be just quickly, because we're running out of time and you have another very important question to answer. Okay,
you're right. You're keeping me on track. Let's go to that question. Thanks, Miranda. Good thoughts there. I mean, trying to make sense of it all is a tall order. Yeah, the last question, just on things that need to be investigated, basically. We've started touching on it, I think, but let's go back and pick up stuff that we haven't covered yet. Can I start with you, Peter? I think you have a slide for us, don't you? And you need to unmute yourself. Thanks.
Right. Let's see. I have.
You have a bunch of tips, don't you? That.
Yes, I do. Okay.
There we go.
Yes.
Brilliant.
I think there's still a big story to be told in many parts of this region, at least, about the procurement, you know, of COVID-19, you know, supplies. A lot of that is still, I think, covered in mystery. You know, all these PPE, you know, that were promised, you know, by different governments. I mean, who actually is bringing them in, and where actually are they being, you know, installed, you know, in hospitals, or, you know, all these health centers and facilities all over the place. I think that that's a story that still needs to be told in many parts of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. Then in some countries like Uganda, where we have had huge, you know, donation drives, again, something could be said about something. There's a story there about, you know, how these donations have been used. I mean, our president has been quite big and strong on asking the public and, you know, all these rich donors to give especially vehicles, you know, four-wheel drive vehicles. What are those vehicles being used for at this point? You know, that story again, I think needs to be told. And then there's a story of the kind of care that COVID-19 patients are receiving. You know, there is a video a while back that went around in this, you know, in Uganda about a woman claiming, you know, that they were being given medication without being told what it was. They were basically like prisoners in some ways. It is very easy to dismiss some of those, you know, videos and some of those allegations, like they were indeed dismissed by the Ministry of Health. But the story needs to be told, you know, what actually is going on? How are these patients being cared for? You know, in the beginning, I think in April or thereabouts, the Ministry of Health actually did mention that Uganda was using hydroxychloroquine and a few of those others as part of their care for patients. Have they stopped after the World Health Organization came out about this? What's really going on in that? And then this may look like a small issue, but I have not seen enough reporting on the decision-making chain in different countries. Where do decisions actually come from before presidents go on the stage to announce, you know, new measures, including lockdowns or lifting of lockdowns and so on? If they're coming from experts, from scientists, as some we have been told sometimes, you know, what kind of interest do these scientists have? What kind of track record do these scientists have? What, you know, what's their story? I mean, what do they stand for? There's a story to be told, I think, there about whether what we are seeing as, you know, measures being attributed to government are in fact part of a collective decision-making process, or whether they are in some ways serving, you know, parochial and, you know, personal interests of some, you know, officials. And then maybe finally, I'll look at two other ideas. One is, and I think Jeanne touched on this, the question of, I'm calling it death because of COVID-19. We have had so far officially only 2 or 3 deaths in Uganda since this pandemic began. But there are so many people who have died because of the lockdown measures. I wish somebody could do an investigation that looks at the numbers of people who are dying from some of these diseases in previous years, let's say last year, same time last year, or even the year before, and compare and see, you know, what actually has been the price of some of these lockdown measures for very many Ugandans who are suffering from other ailments. And then, of course, as you all know, we are going, so many countries are going through elections, either in the coming months or, you know, early next year. What has happened elsewhere where countries have had elections? You know, is it in Asia, in you know, in Europe? How can we sort of learn from what has happened there to tell better stories about the possibility of having credible elections without, you know, and without them being undermined by all this fear mongering and all that? How can you strike that balance between public health and public representation and, you know, democracy and accountable government? I think that too is a story that still needs to be told. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. What a good list of work for us all to do. No, really, really interesting. Miranda, your wish list.
Very quick. Definitely looking into legal enrichment over this time. I think, you know, by the fall, it's been 6 months. A lot of money has been spent. You know, records should be available. Government officials are back at work, so we can actually start asking questions and basically raising these issues. I think one interesting topic is all the laws and regulations that have been changed in secret, in part because the government meetings are taking place online. Sometimes the minutes are lost. There has been a lot that was changed in the meantime. I think also looking into, I'm especially seeing this in terms of like environment, construction of the illegal dams and so on, like a lot of things that normally would, you know, result in protests and you know, citizens being unhappy have happened or are still happening behind the eyesight. So I think this is another a very good topic for people to look into. And obviously, you know, Peter mentioned elections. I think it's a big issue, not just from the standpoint of, you know, public risks, but also from the standpoint of what government have done to basically preserve themselves on power. And we are seeing that in a lot of ways, the government are twisting what's happening with the COVID in order to ensure elections, but also basically buying the support. And then final topic I find fascinating is basically reputation laundering, because I've seen that in many places where the government has been weak, organized crime figures, people who have been alleged that to have, or say even sentenced for corruption or stealing money for public, are now appearing as donors for COVID and actually running PR campaigns about it. I find it actually fascinating. And I think it's one of the topics to basically look into and basically see what is going on there.
Thank you, Miranda. Really great suggestions. Thank you very much. We're actually, just to let people know, we're going to be doing some look-aheads here on our website. So a lot of these ideas attributed to all of you will appear, I hope. Jeanne, your last thoughts on things to look forward to, or things we should be doing, really?
Well, everybody else has covered great stuff. All I want to add is that the list of industry independent medical experts is a living, breathing list, and I encourage all other journalists, you can make nominations for experts you find are independent to go on the list. We need to share these resources, and it's really important because virologists are running biotech firms that then sell the test kits. They've got big money involved, pharma's involved. These are billions of dollars, often dark money that we don't see or know about. So I encourage, if we can share that list, make your nominations. There's a panel of 4 journalists and physicians who review each nominee. We make sure that they do not have conflicting financial interests, and then we can all turn to these experts about these medical issues.
Thank you. Very good suggestion. Really good one. And Syed, your last words before we go to questions.
Yeah, no, I think great suggestions. I think that these all, as Miranda said and Peter and Jeanne mentioned, there are a number of stories for us to cover in the next couple of months, actually. But I think we will be having one challenge, because there has been so much coverage on COVID and there's a fatigue about how much you can read about it. I think that the journalists will face that challenge moving forward. So how will you make your stories more engaging, interesting, insightful for the audiences so that they deal with this fatigue of reading too much and hearing too much about COVID? And that's why the journalists need to put more energy into evidence-based reporting so that they're informing all the time readers about the new challenges, new dangers, and a lot of loopholes in the response system to the COVID-19. I also feel like, given there are, as Miranda mentioned earlier, things are changing very fast. So the moment you finish one story, there are already 10, 20, 100 deaths happening. So you're moving to another death story, covering another death in the town, or another case in the town, or a hospital which has got hit with a number of COVID cases. So I think it's fundamentally important for editors essentially to decide early, actually, what are the stories they're going to cover or uncover in the next couple of months, and put a couple of people there while they do the routine daily stuff, day-to-day news reporting, which is bread and butter, but they should allocate 1 or 2 journalists who can just look at this big picture and capture that story. Because in this all hundreds of thousands of stories, we're missing big stories because journalists are also overburdened. So I think that's my 2 bit at the end, I think.
That also takes up Miranda's point about going back to some of the big issues that are still undocumented and misunderstood or not fully understood, and trying to do a catch up on some of the issues so that people get some level of clarity, maybe greater level of clarity. Good point. Thank you. We have some questions, and I'm going to ask my colleague Eunice to join us now. Hi, Eunice. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Well, we're going to have 2 good questions here that I want to ask, and we were wondering if the speakers themselves, because we have such a great group here, whether you guys have any questions for each other and we can continue the conversation like that. But the first one is, as the medical industry is racing to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, do the speakers have suggestions of what angles we should investigate for vaccine production or testing of the vaccines, or is it too soon to dive into this? I just remembered there's a second question for Jeanne Lenzer, specifically for journalists in countries where they don't have such a useful list of industry independent experts. What are the key points journalists should have in mind to assess whether an expert is independent or not, especially in countries where it's standard to have pharma inviting doctors to conferences, all expenses paid, or other practices that could influence their work? So yeah, let's start with those two.
Yeah,
So,
Jeanne, please go
for
ahead.
the independents, first of all, that list is an international list, and we do encourage journalists from every country to make submissions about nominees. And how can you do it within your own country? It can be hard. I mean, I've investigated doctors who reported positively on certain treatments who denied that they had any financial interest, and they would just deny them blatantly to me, even though I could easily find, for example, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that they actually did have financial conflicts, and then they just say, oh, I forgot. So, you know, it is difficult, but with the internet these days, you can also contact some of these experts in any country to get some input. As for vaccines, I don't really have any real insights about that at this point. It takes a lot of time to look at vaccines, but you know, understandably, we can't know whether a vaccine is safe or not immediately. Sometimes they do have to get into widespread use before we find out what kinds of issues there are. But, you know, that happens on rare occasion. Most vaccines have been very safe. Some have not. Some have been deadly, but most are generally safe. So we'll have to see.
Great, thanks a
Can
lot.
I say something about vaccines?
Please.
Yeah, I think that journalists need to you know, get an understanding of how this process usually plays out ordinarily, you know, how are vaccines developed, you know, and we know that this is an unprecedented, you know, situation, and this is, you know, huge and all that, but all these promises about, you know, a quick vaccine political, are they following the same kind of protocols that would ordinarily be followed? Are we actually seeing, you know, all these promises, are they being, you know, informed by political interest, or are they actually, you know, informed by good science? I think we can ask questions and talk to experts, including WHO, you know, about whether all these prospects of a vaccine at the end of the year or the next year are really, really reasonable based on what usually happens.
Oh, could I jump back in?
Oh,
For a quick
please keep
second?
going. Anybody else as well? By all
Thanks.
means, let's just
Peter,
open it up.
Yeah, Peter raises a hugely important point, and of course, U.S. pharmaceutical corporations have totally abused people in other countries as test subjects. And so, you know, when people look askance at certain areas that don't want to take vaccine, it's actually been very reasonable, in part because of what U.S. corporations have done. I'll come back to another point later. I've forgotten what I was thinking. Yeah.
Peter, did you want to jump in there again on the vaccine point? No. Sorry, you're on mute. Okay. What about the Syed? Can I ask you a question? What about this idea of the doctors list that of reputable doctors? How does that work in India with your networks? How are you checking out the sources that you use from the medical world for the reasons for independence?
No, I think that's really a fundamental question, because we have seen the medical industry, unfortunately, is one of the most corrupt industry in the world. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the relationship between the pharma and the medicine has been remarkably captured by investigative journalist Catherine Niban in the book called Bottle of Lies, which is essentially about the generic medicine. And, you know, so unfortunately, that has been the case in India and in most of Asian countries, where the pharmaceutical industries managed to manipulate a lot of things because of this corruption. So I think having independent doctors, I think there are a number of doctors. They're remarkable experts. I think we're lucky, to be honest, to have a lot of think tanks in Asia. I can say at least in India, we have seen a huge number of doctors who came forward, mostly essentially public health experts, virologists, and scientists coming forward and, you know, offering their advices openly. Actually, some of them have started their own blogs because of this need of coming forward and making point. And we also saw, like, coming back on a vaccination, which I think somebody said, what are the things they can look at? And I think the vaccination is the one thing every investigative journalist should pay attention in the next couple of months, because that is where the business is, that's where the risk is, that's where the danger is, that's where the corruption will happen eventually in a lot of different places of the world. So I will suggest that if you are a journalist covering your country, pay attention to the global tenders of your government. Pay attention to what they call request for proposal notices, tender notices. And also one other area which is extremely important is the medical misinformation about the vaccines. Like if you follow social media, you must have already seen there are hundreds and hundreds of videos putting question mark on different initiatives around the world. And there are people behind these videos or this social media campaign against particular, you can say a country or particular interests or particular groups. So there is a lot of people who are actually working behind the curtain on social media, trying to make money also or damage reputations behind the dark wall of Facebook and other platforms.
Yes, well said. That's really interesting. Miranda, your point about not relying on official government media and finding sources. Do you want to say a little more about that? With the fact that government ministers and other officials are meeting on Zoom and there's no records or less records, and that a lot of decisions are being made. Can you talk a little bit more about that for a moment? What areas are you thinking of in particular?
So I will just, before I answer that, I just want to go back to the matter of vaccine. I think one thing that I'm noticing, in my country, obviously we don't have strong pharmaceutical industry, so we are not developing vaccines. But when media are reporting about tests, they're often saying that tests are being carried without actually looking into what is the age group on which the tests are being carried. So even when they say it's successful, is it success rate when you're 50 or 40, or it's a success rate when you're somebody who is like 70 years old? So I think this is kind of like important topic to look into. In terms of looking into what government is reporting, I'll give you one example. We have recently looked in Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan, and we discovered that the government has passed a law which allows it to basically, so normally countries have, they can do expedited procurement if there is a pandemic or if there is a crisis and they need urgently to buy something. In Kyrgyzstan, they have changed the law which allowed them to make any spending in preparation of the crisis untransparent. And that was passed without public being ever notified. It turned out to be just, a decree signed by the president. In my country, for example, some of the key decisions that are being made, we're now seeing that there's no minutes of the meeting. And nobody's basically stating what happened and why the decision was made and so on. So I think in part, reporters need to start developing contacts with the people who are sitting on these meetings and basically, finding out as it's happening what is going on. But also what we're seeing is that, again, I'm going to use example Central Asia because this is where a lot of my work is currently based, and I'm working with reporters. And one thing we started doing is, we made for one story we're currently working on, we made a list about 50 people who might know something about it, and it seemed very ambitious. But then it turned out that a lot of these people are really sitting home and would be willing to speak if reporters reaches out to them. So I think in this case, it's a perfect timing to try to develop these connections.
It's a very good tip. Yeah, it's a good tip. Thank you.
Also,
sorry.
And then also another thing, I think it's really good to stand out in terms of how you report your stories, because I think for many media, especially good investigative organization, the pandemic has really been opportunity rather than a problem, and it has really raised the level of credibility. And I think, from what I'm seeing with, work of reporters I'm working with, they're getting more and more, groups, including like law enforcement, who come to them and say, can you, we want to share the information. Can you do a story about, arrests or investigation we are doing, because, we have, we want it done well. And I think, the credibility and the information and the way that reporters are publishing stories really helps them get new sources.
Great. Thank you for the point. Does anyone want to add anything? I'm going to ask Eunice, actually. I think we've got another question. Yeah, thanks, Eunice.
Yes, COVID-19 has exposed and highlighted deep social inequalities. So will we see more of this? And if so, what kind of issues? What else should we be examining in social inequality?
Thanks for the question. Who wants to have a go at it? Peter, do you want to have a shot at it?
Yes, I think somebody mentioned earlier on that, these lockdown measures should not be seen as one thing. I mean, there are so many different people who are being affected differently. Richer people in very many countries, are able to actually self-isolate and, stay at home and all that, There are very many people who live from hand to mouth, who cannot afford to be away from work or from the city or, that's why they earn a living. So I think that, inequalities are definitely part of this story. And the good thing, though, is that a lot of the reporting we have seen, at least here and in neighboring Kenya, has by and large covered a lot of the issues around the impact of this pandemic on the ordinary person in all its aspects, whether it is health care, whether it is, income, whether it is food, access to food, and, all those other essentials, of life. So it is, I think, a very big part of this story, and it's going to be around for a while.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
I think one of the stories we need to pay attention on inequality is actually the situation of migrants across the world, actually. People who have jobs in other places, migration within the country, migration outside the country. People are losing jobs, they're coming back to their homes, and how the condition and all around their stories are really powerful. And I think another thing we may find really great insight if we monitor the suicide data, because we have seen already a number of people committing suicide because of a lot of issues related to the COVID, whether that is a job loss or health. I think that will be also a very important area to see whether there has been any unprecedented spike or hike of the cases or in which people ended their lives because of the situation they found themselves in.
Very good point. Thank you. I mean, we're running out of time. I just want to give everyone, all the speakers, a last chance if they wish to say anything else, add anything. Sure, please.
I'd like to add just one word of caution, and that is in what we've been talking about, disaggregating the various aspects of lockdown. I just recently looked at the data at CDC from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of flu from the most recent season compared to COVID. And up to about the age 50, there was no difference in the number of deaths from what's been reported to date in COVID and flu. After the age of 50, it becomes very serious, and there are many more deaths recorded. So what does that mean when we look at policies? Sending young children to school. Actually, I have the numbers for young children under 18. There were 743 deaths from flu, 35 deaths from COVID. So, we really need to separate those pieces of the puzzle out. The other thing is, besides industry independent individual experts, we also have a list of industry independent organizations. And I want to mention that, with all the crazy stuff that's on the internet, there's a tendency to turn to the seemingly reliable organizations like the CDC and WHO. And unfortunately, I list on the tip sheet some links to problems where industry has even infiltrated the outcomes of these organizations at times. I mean, at times what they're saying is good and useful and helpful, but at other times, as we've demonstrated, their campaigns have been launched entirely by industry.
Thank you for that point. And Miranda, last word to you.
Well, I just want to say that, the COVID is here to stay. I think we also need to remember that there are other important things that are happening. And, we as investigative reporter should keep an eye and continue to be watchdog of what our governments are doing. And, do investigation also in other areas. I was going to mention something before about the COVID, but my thought escaped me, so that's it.
You're right that although COVID is a kind of filter of a lot of things like inequality and so on, there's also other things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember what I wanted to say. So one thing that we are noticing is that government, this was something that reporters in Kyrgyzstan were working on, is they discovered that government is saying that they're paying medical workers and they're basically providing help to families in need. But then the people who were supposed to receive help have not been receiving it. And I think that will be a very interesting topic to follow and basically see who is really getting the aid and, is the money really going to help those who are impoverished?
Yes, thank you for the last point there. Thank you. Well, okay, what a great session it's been. Thank you, everyone. It's really, really been interesting. There's a great analysis there of what's going on, what's being reported, and a great long list of things to do for sure. So it's been a great session, and thank you all very much. And I want to thank my colleagues at GIJN who've been working behind the scenes to produce this event. Thank you to them. Thank you to the audience. And once again, thank you to Syed, Miranda, Peter, and Jeanne for a really, really interesting webinar. Before I say goodbye, though, two quick things. We're going to do we are going to do a questionnaire on our webinars. So anyone who's been involved or registered for one of our webinars will be sent this few questions, and we'd be most grateful for all the responses if you could send back to us. It'll help us to improve. And secondly, and finally, in September, we start a new series of GIJN online events on COVID and also on not on COVID. It'll be workshops, webinars, and all kinds of things, starting Thursday, the 3rd of September, with a 4-part series on digging into disappearances, organized crime, and missing people. We have sessions in English, French, and Spanish. So watch our Twitter feed, watch our website, and look forward to seeing everyone again then or soon after. Once again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Bye for now.